Hello students, welcome to the class on planned economy and neoliberalism. The objective of this session is 1. To understand the success and failures of Indian planning. 2. To throw light on the debate as to the form of planning which suits most the Indian situation at present. 3. To study the formulation and implementation of plans. 4. To elucidate the neoliberal thinking on the planning process. 5. To examine the role of public participation in the planning process. The planning process in India has been criticized for defects in its form and policy frame and implementation failures. 1. Inappropriate form of economic planning. Areas of omission undermine the importance of Indian plan models. First is the fact of prices being left out of all account in these models. Secondly, while technological changes lie at the heart of the development process, plan models assumed constant coefficients, implying that technology would remain unchanged over time. The Indian planning has implicitly vested the planner with full authority of decision making power in respect of all the decision variables included in the plans. The political philosophy of economic planning in India has been patently wrong. The supposition that in course of time public sector would grow sufficiently large and would constitute the core of the planned economy had no basis. The role of public sector ultimately depends entirely on the classes which have control over the state power. In any class society, no instrument of economic planning can perform the task of transforming the social relations. 2. Absence of financial strategy. The planning process in India suffered from the absence of financial strategy. It goes without saying that the implementation of heavy investment goods sector strategy required heavy resources both domestic, monetary and real, and external in the form of capital goods, machinery, industrial raw materials and technical knowledge. On both these fronts, however, there was a surprising lack of concern and rational economic thinking, and whatever planning was done was in the form of ad hoc measures. As far as raising the financial resources on the domestic front is concerned, it was necessary to lay down detailed policies and specify the wherewithals. This was not done. The assumption involved was that what is physically possible is financially possible too, which was inherently wrong. The neglect of financial strategy proved fatal. The plans continually increased in size, and in the absence of financial strategy, the government was forced to depend more and more on deficit financing. Under the 7th plan, this also necessitated sharp increases in administered prices. The inflationary forces unleashed by these methods of financing have created various complications in the planning process. Coming down to external methods of raising resources, one again finds an absence of any strategy. All attempts or measures adopted were for a considerable period ad hoc in nature and were not interwoven into a well thought out strategy. The best method of raising external resources is by earning more through expansion of exports. Therefore, as far as the necessity of raising external resources is concerned, export strategy should have formed an integral part of the overall planning strategy. Export sector was a neglected sector for a considerable period of planning. The planners paid more attention to the policy of restricting imports, and practically every import policy declared by the Government of India slashed imports, so much so that by the end of the 3rd plan, it was being felt that the policy of import restriction had reached its limits. It was only then that some serious thinking on export front was done. For a considerable part of the planning period, we have carried on without any export strategy, and the huge balance of payments deficit had to be covered by foreign aid, which introduced an element of uncertainty in the whole planning process. 3. Misplaced faith in investment. India's development strategy gave primacy to the rate of investment in the overall planning process. The emphasis on rate of investment as a growth determining and growth generating factor led to the belief that more investment was the panacea of all economic ills, and consequently attention should be concentrated on increasing the rate of investment. This concealed from us the importance of many other factors in economic development, such as improvement in skills, techniques, management, operational efficiency and human capital in general. Neither was any attention paid to assess the adequacy and efficiency of the administrative machinery in the country, which was to be entrusted with the task of implementing ever increasing programs of investment. Undue importance attached to the rate of investment as a part of planning also led to a neglect of certain fields which, though not contributing much to the rate of growth, would have helped to make planning more broad-based and more purposeful, and might have elicited the active cooperation and participation of masses, which is essential if planning has to make a dent on poverty and economic backwardness. The total concentration on the rate of investment led to a failure to assess the importance of the production relations aspect of economic dynamics. 4. Flaws in industrial strategy. Though emphasis remained on increasing the amount of investment in the industrial sector as a whole, the planners did not care to influence the structure of such investment in a decisive manner. This allowed scope for distortions in the industrial sector. Between the mid-1960s and the late 1970s was characterized by a rapid growth of consumer goods industries catering to the demands of the richer sections of population, and a relatively slower rate of growth of basic and capital goods industries, a structural retrogression in the Indian economy. This structural retrogression was also accompanied by low rate of industrial growth or industrial deceleration. During the 1980s, the industrial sector, in response to the liberalization policy of the government, showed definite signs of recovery. The industrial output in this period increased at an annual rate of 7.8%. However, distortions in the industrial sector further increased. This is clear from the fact that consumer durable sector registered the highest rate of growth, equaling 14.7% per annum as against 7.5% per annum increase in overall industrial production during 1981 to 1988. The implementation of the industrial strategy required massive investment by the central government in a number of industries. However, before undertaking actual investment, it was necessary to 1. Determine the type of machines to be produced initially in the capital goods industries. 2. Define the time phasing of different industries, keeping the social considerations in view. 3. Determine the capacity of the existing skilled personnel and administration to actually carry out the plans. 4. Take into account the various managerial and organizational problems, both existing and potential. And 5. Carry out detailed and in-depth project studies at the micro level and link them to the macro level plans to ensure that the whole program is carried out in an efficient and integrated manner. However, these considerations were unfortunately ignored. This resulted in delays in completion of major projects, lags causing inter-industry bottlenecks, bunching of capital goods projects, inefficient formulation and selection of actual projects, underutilization of capacity in many industries, higher than estimated costs and a number of other problems. On account of reasons such as these, a majority of public sector projects took longer to complete than was originally estimated. Benefits from them came in later than expected and their cost turned out to be more than what was originally estimated. Major steel, heavy machinery, fertilizers and chemical plants lagged behind schedules and through forward and backward linkages had an adverse effect on the development of a number of other industries. 5. Neglect of employment strategy. Provision of employment to all those seeking employment has been explicitly recognized as an important objective of planning in many plan documents and is also implicit in the task the planners conferred upon themselves, establishment of a socialist pattern of society. Yet, it is surprising to note the casual way in which the problem has been faced. The planners assumed that production and employment are uniquely and directly related. Consequently, no attempt was made to formulate an employment strategy as such. However, data reveal that the assumption of unique and direct relationship between production and employment was not justified. Thus, while over the period 1951 to 1969, factory production rose at an annual compound rate of 7%, employment rose at less than 3% per annum. 1978 to 1983 prepared by the Janata government noted that though investment and output had grown at a high rate, the capital intensive nature of the production mix and the technology mix had prevented employment from growing. Thus, between 1961 and 1976, although investment in modern factory sector increased by 139% and output by 161%, employment could increase only by 71%. Estimates of the employment elasticity presented in the 9th 5-year plan and the 10th 5-year plan show that there was a steady decline in employment elasticity over the period of 1970s to 1990s. According to 10th plan, the overall employment elasticity during 1983 to 1993-94 was 0.52 and this fell to only 0.16 during 1993-94 to 1999-2000. As a result, the rate of growth of employment fell considerably. In addition to the unrealistic assumption about the relationship between production and employment, neglect of the employment strategy also arose from the nature of the planning models wherein attention was concentrated on scarce resources like capital and foreign exchange and labour. On account of its abundant availability was not considered at all. In fairness to planners, it should be admitted that each plan provided for special schemes for provision of employment opportunities. The third plan introduced the Rural Works Program, which was carried forward in the fourth plan. The fourth plan introduced, in addition, a number of rural employment schemes like the CSRE, SFDA, MFAL, DPAP, etc. However, all these schemes were hurriedly drawn up, were ill conceived and ad hoc and consequently doomed to failure. Since no proper synchronization of these schemes was done with the 5-year plans, there was substantial wastage of resources and the implementing machinery did not undertake them seriously at all. The National Rural Employment Program NREP, the Rural Landless Employment Guarantee Program RLEGP and the Integrated Rural Development Program IRDP were undertaken as an integral part of the sixth plan and were continued under the seventh plan. The Jawahar Rojgar Yojana was launched in 1989. It was restructured in March 1999 and was renamed as Jawahar Gram Samriddhi Yojana. Prime Minister Rojgar Yojana was launched during the 8th plan and was continued in the 9th 5-year plan. The latter employment programs were much better conceived than the earlier employment schemes. Nonetheless, they failed to tackle the unemployment problem in the country. It's only with the initiation of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in 2006 that some amount of seriousness in tackling the problem of rural unemployment is in evidence, although a lot of problems are being encountered at the implementation level. Finally, the failure on the part of the government to evolve an integrated educational and employment strategy is obvious. The vast expansion of secondary and college education at a rate much faster than the requirements of the economy has created an imbalance in the system, resulting in the problem of educated unemployed. Universities and colleges have tended to become places of refuge where the student spends as many years as possible in a socially acceptable environment and at public cost. Education not related to the requirements of the economy has resulted in two destabilizing factors. One, a vast army of educated unemployed has been created, with a majority of them striving for white collar jobs and despising manual work. And two, we find a situation where, while on one hand many trained persons go without jobs, on the other the right type of persons with specific and desired skill and training are not available. Though a number of vocational schools are being set up to deal with this problem, no attempt is being made to specific requirements of skilled persons in different fields. Vocational training in such an atmosphere will only succeed in transferring the incidence of unemployment from one area to another. 6. Neglect of social justice. Social justice in the Indian context implies poverty alleviation and reduction in income inequalities. The Indian plans, however, have not paid the required attention to these objectives. The data presented in the 6th 5-year plan document reveal that 50.82% of rural population and 38.19% of urban population were below the poverty line in 1977-78. The combined percentage for rural and urban population in that year stood at 48.13. The expert group appointed by the Planning Commission under the chairmanship of Suresh D. Tendulkar has, in its report released in November 2009, pointed out that 41.8% of the rural population and 25.7% of the urban population was below the poverty line in 2004-05. For the country as a whole, 37.2% of the people were below the poverty line in 2004-05. There were extreme inequalities in income and wealth when planning process was initiated in India. To begin with, the planners had relied on trickle-down effect for reduction in income disparities. Having realized that this was not working in India, reduction in income inequalities was proclaimed as an explicit objective of economic planning. Nonetheless, this objective was never in focus. In fact, income inequalities have increased over time. For example, the share of the top 10% households in household expenditure rose from 27.1% in 1989-90 to 31.1% in 2004-05. The share of the top 20% of households in household expenditure, which was 41.3% in 1985-90, rose to as high as 45.3% in 2004-05. The black income in the economy has also increased substantially. It is estimated to have grown from 9.5% of GNP in 1967-68 to 27% in 1973-74 and further to 40% in 1995-96. This has concentrated tremendous economic and political power in the hands of a selected group of people who are now in a position to guide all economic policies in their favor. Naturally, corruption and various antisocial activities have got encouragement. 7. Implementation failure. In India, the plans have often failed to realize their proclaimed objectives. The macro targets have rarely been achieved under various plans. At the micro level, completion of different projects has taken more time than expected. An implementational failure may be said to arise if one or more of the following conditions hold. 1. Planning authorities are plainly inefficient in gathering the relevant information within the needed range of precision. 2. Planning authorities respond with considerable time lags when the underlying situation changes. 3. Agencies through which the planning authorities are supposed to implement plans have little or no capacity or in some cases motivation to carry them out. Thus, economic planning in India no longer excites imagination. In fact, it no longer seems important. This was not the attitude towards planning until recently. Let us therefore examine as to why there is so much disillusionment with planning in this country. We shall also examine whether planning has lost all relevance in the new situation or it is still needed to accomplish certain objectives. In India, all the plans have stressed the need for efficient allocation of resource. A growth rate of 3.5% per annum over the first 3 decades of economic planning is being considered most unsatisfactory. Even the growth rate of 5.7% per annum during the period 1980-81 to 2008-9 is not comparable to what some countries in East Asia have achieved over the same period. It is quite distressing that the growth performance in India has been poor despite some improvements in the savings and investment rates. Now, a wider section of economists has started believing that a much higher growth rate could have been achieved if only more liberal economic policies had been followed. Economic planning did not perform satisfactorily on equity front either. By any reckoning, according to Indian government estimates, as in 2012, 21.9% of the population still remains below the poverty line, while the World Bank in 2011 estimated 23.6% of Indian population below the poverty line. Hence, disillusionment with planning seems to be natural. Economic planning was adopted in India because it could compensate for market failure. But almost 6 decades of development planning have shown that there can be government failure as well. In this country, the regulatory system caused economic losses due to misallocation of resources resulting from wrong investment decisions and diversion of resources. Thus, there can be both government failure and market failure. Neoclassical thinking. The decentralized planning is closer to the neoclassical view of the functioning of economies, which lays stress on markets and prices, with public sector confined to selective programs only. This view is based on the assumption that the quantities or supplies of goods and services are flexible and that the resources or factors are mobile. It is also believed that producers and consumers respond to price signals. It is also contended that the producers seek to maximize profits and change their methods of production when input prices change. This view rendered for planning means that the market and the price mechanism rather than controls and directives as under the structuralist view are required for better planning. This view also permits incorporation of public investment in certain selected lines. These are largely those where private enterprise is not suitable, such as infrastructure, education, health, etc. That is where investments are large, gestation period is long and the direct returns are small or nil. Where market failures are inherent, such as control of environmental pollution, that is market not taking account of the externalities, etc. It is argued that the market in the less developed countries may not be developed and the price mechanism may be distorted. But the advocates of this view stress that the efficacy of this method is apparent from the successes achieved in the developed countries. And they plead for the orientation of planning in these countries towards making a greater use of markets and prices, at the same time improving upon them by organizing a greater flow of information, increasing competition, reducing monopoly elements, etc. Let us now turn to the merits of decentralized planning. At present, decentralized planning is becoming increasingly popular throughout the world. India too began with a largely comprehensive centralized planning. A shift away from it started during the 1970s. This development accelerated during the 6th Plan 1980 to 1985, which included for the first time an extensive discussion on price policy. Since then, a greater role has been allowed to the price mechanism in the allocation of resources. The 8th Plan 1992 to 1997 marks a decisive shift towards this sort of planning. 1. Efficiency. A. Use of resources. One basic reason in favor of this sort of planning is that it promotes efficiency in the use of resources. Since administrative or bureaucratic involvement is absent, the resource allocations take place on the basis of economic criteria. In other words, resources move into lines where these give the maximum returns. And this phenomenon is widespread and not confined to a few resources or products. Further, since no administrative costs are involved, the resource allocation is done in a costless manner. And even if there are some costs, these are minimum. B. Technology of production. With profit as a motive, the entrepreneurs constantly work for reducing the costs. They also change their methods of production when input prices change. In the context of Indian conditions, for example, an employment orientation to resource use coupled with efficiency can be brought about by a change in the relative resource prices so that capital becomes dear relative to labor. In this milieu, the producers will employ more labor relative to capital. 2. Flexibility. Within a plan, the changes in prices in response to developments foreseen or unforeseen give signals to the economic agents to adjust to the new situations. The adjustments may take place in the form of changes in allocations, in production, in inventories, in exports, in imports, etc. What it implies is that the prices are being used as a signal mechanism for adjustment. In yet another important way, decentralized planning provides for flexibility. It concerns the very contents of planning. This system envisages forecasting rather than targeting. The forecasting provides a frame and the lines along which the economy is likely to move. It may or may not go the expected way or to the expected extent. Alternatively, this system of planning rests on the assumption that changes in the plans may have to be made keeping in view the developments in future. In either case, flexibility is made the hallmark of planning. 3. Public participation. An advantage of crucial significance is that this decentralized planning provides for an active public participation in the planning process, both in plan making and plan implementation. In one case, it permits elected bodies at various levels, the centre, the states, the districts, blocks, villages, to get involved in it. This enables the public to play an important role in putting pressure on state policy and on the private sector directly or through state policy. Public pressure together with a free press makes the state responsive towards the demands of the people that it should take heed of the public welfare. Through the devolution of the planning functions to lower level government units as being provided in the 9th Plan 1997 to 2002, it will become possible to prepare realistic plans tailored to the local needs and resources with much of welfare orientation. Such plans will also be executed fully. In another case, the public participation takes place via the market and the price mechanism. Implied in this type of planning is the involvement of the large number of producers competing among themselves with the sole objective of making maximum profits through production as per the market costs and prices. Consumers constituting the largest number get involved when they make choices among the products and services. Given adequate information, they exert pressure on the system in a way that supplies become adequate, their quality is constantly upgraded and prices constantly lowered. In India, the decentralized planning is being thought of at two planes. At one plane, the method of planning largely centralized at the level of central government and to an extent also at the level of state government is sought to be changed by passing on to the governments at the district, block, village levels a part of the task of plan making and plan implementation. At another plane, the case is being made for the use of market and market related prices and incentives for purposes of planning. With the formation of Niti Aayog, the National Institution for Transforming India in January 2015, the principle of cooperative federalism has been introduced in the planning process. This new body has debunked the one-size-fits-all approach towards development and will take into account India's diversity and plurality. A pro-people, proactive and participative development agenda stressing on empowerment and equality is a guiding principle behind Niti Aayog. The body serves as a think tank of the government, a directional and policy instrument. Conclusion. Students, we can now conclude that the centralized planning, despite its achievements, is outdated and entails inefficient, costly and inflexible use of resources. The decentralized planning, on the other hand, not only gets over the weaknesses of the centralized planning, it makes economic development a people's affair both in the use of resources and in securing optimum results from them. Thank you.